All right. Okay, Dad. Okay, Gary. All right, let's see. Today we're talking about high philosophy. That'd be a good name for a band.
You should start a band.
I've been in a few bands.
But like the other guys.
What? I can't even hear what you're saying.
You name it high philosophy, like the other highs, like they're going to get a lot more attraction.
Yeah, that's probably true, but you cannot do philosophy while you're high. Or you,
I feel like you can only do it when you're high.
well, you probably do crappy philosophy when you're high. In fact, you know what? That explains a lot of philosophy. I think that explains a lot of philosophy. I mean, some of the stuff you read in philosophy, especially this continental stuff, continental. I'm not a big fan of continental philosophy. Continental philosophy as distinguished from what? Continental. I had a friend that used to make a joke that continental philosophy is a lot like continental breakfast. They're just very cheap and unsubstantial and not worth getting up for. All right, so where is everybody? Because this is probably one of the best things we talk about, period, ever in your life. Yeah, we started with that, didn't we? So we're talking about, does anybody even remember? Oh, before I say this, guys, before we get into this, I'm going to hide my eyes when I say this because it makes me feel bad to even say it. All right, you ready? Guys, when you do your papers, your reflection papers, right? When you turn those in, first it's easy, right? Turn them in. Some of you guys, like your grade is, it honestly is just gosh awful because you haven't turned in your papers. But when you turn them in, you know that, man, I've been doing philosophy for not a super long time, but at least 10 years or so. So when I'm reading these things, like I can tell like what you wrote, you know what I'm saying? And what somebody on the internet wrote. I mean, it's easy. Like it's easy to see copy and paste. It's so easy to see that. Why? Again, because I'm brilliant? No, but because, man, I've been in this crap for too long, you know what I'm saying? And so Georgia Highlands, you know, their policy is, you know, in regards to plagiarism is essentially pretty staunch in the sense that you get either tossed out of school or you have to do some sort of community, whatever, some kind of something, because I had to look it up. Guys, when you write your junk, if you're going to quote anybody, make sure, I mean, remember, these reflection papers aren't looking for, you know, formatting and all this kind of stuff, but you still have to give credit where credit's due if you didn't write something, right? So especially if you write, you know, like 5 paragraphs in a row. Guys, last semester I had one person do that, and I had to give them a 0 and then say, like, look, if you do this again, I'm gonna have to turn you into the academic dean. I didn't do it again, right? So make sure you don't do that. Make sure when you write something, remember, I'm not looking for, you know, some sort of new contribution to philosophy in the sense that it has to be 100% completely original. I just want to see that you are thinking with what we're doing in class, right? Even if that means, man, I had a hard time. I don't even know what we're talking about this week. It was tough. I mean, because at least I know that's you, right? You're not copying and pasting somebody else. So please don't do that, man, because I really don't want to see you go to prison for the rest of your life for plagiarizing. All right. With that said, don't freaking plagiarize. Epistemology section. This will probably be one of the funnest. Yeah, most fun.
I used the quote you used in class and I gave the name. Is that enough information, the name of the person who said the quote?
I don't even remember, but I know that you're not who I'm talking about, so you probably don't have to worry about it.
Okay, that's fine. Because I was like, should I have like included? Because I did copy paste that. But I'm like overthinking that.
Right, yeah, you're not, I'm not. I mean, there were some folks I was like, no, I know this. I mean, when you're like what, 19 years old and you're taking an intro to philosophy class for the very first time and you start talking about Noam Chomsky and all these, like, I'm like, this isn't you. Like, I notice it. All I have to do is go over here, click copy and paste, click in Google, and then I can see the paper you got that from. I'm like, this is easy. Come on. Like this, I'm not an idiot. Well, I mean, I am an idiot, but I'm not that much of an idiot, right? So he's like a modern philosopher.
No, I mean, was he involved?
Oh yeah, he's in this class.
Probably.
So with that said, today will probably be, at least it should be, one of the most fun philosophy classes that we have, because this is rounding up our epistemology section. Where did we leave off in epistemology? Does anybody remember? What is flipping epistemology to begin with? What is it? Well, how we know, right?
Yeah.
Like how we know, or even more radically in the modern sense of can we know, really? You know, like how this is
Well,
this.
we left off on skepticism.
Right, because I was trying to argue that both of those systems really just tailspin into skepticism, right? Now, so what we're going to begin with is we're going to talk about, we're going to start right with skepticism, because what is radical skepticism? I don't like how your book calls moderate skepticism. I don't like that. I just call that critical thinking, right? What does your book call modern skepticism? Modern. What does your book call modest skepticism? What does it call it? It calls it modest, right? What do they mean by modest skepticism?
Essentially, you don't believe anything until you have some sort of evidence to prove it.
Right, or at least like good reason, right? Some sort of good reason to believe something. I don't like calling that modest skepticism. I like just to call that critical thinking,
Yeah.
right? But your book calls it modest skepticism. But radical skepticism is what?
You could never know anything ever. Forever.
Right, that we can't know anything, right? It's the guy that walks around, you know, again, maybe he's had a philosophy class, or maybe he's just like
A philosophy.
yeah, literally like a philosophy class. And so he thinks that he's like, yeah, I've had this philosophy class, or maybe he's like a, you know, somewhat would like to dub himself as an intellectual. And so he's like, we can't know anything, you know, we don't know anything. There's too much, there's too many variables in reality that we can't know, all this kind of stuff, right? Now, so what we're going to start with is how do you refute radical skepticism? Because it's easy to walk in here, as we've talked about before, it's easy to walk in here and just question everything, right? That's the easy part. Like, who can't do that? So why does the guy that walks around questioning everything, why is he the guy that sounds like he's the intellectual? Or that he's the thinker? Why is that the guy?
Yes, it can't be disproven if you make like a stand and then it's wrong. You can.
Right. I mean, it's easy to make you look stupid, right?
You know
Right.
what I mean?
Right. I mean, it's easy to make you look stupid by just questioning everything, right? So, like, there's an author back in the day named Chesterton. He walks up and he's talking about an epistemological type of issue. And then he says, all right, this is like the guy who walks up to you and say you're outside or whatever, you're enjoying the day. And the guy walks up to you and he's like, why is civilization better than complete savagery? Well, that's just something that you take as so for granted that what? What do you have a hard time doing? Right. Like Chesterton says, like, well, I mean, you just look over at the stop sign and you look at like the street light and you see a policeman on the corner and you look at a car. Like, it's just one of those things you've so taken for granted that you're not even ready to try to respond to that. Right. I mean, you're just kind of like, oh, well, I mean, you know, I mean, look, well, the guy comes across as looking like what? He comes across as like the intellectual and because you can't even prove that. He's like, see, you don't even know why, and walks off. But the problem is anybody can do that. Anybody can do that. Why does that count? Right? So again, like what we want to go back to is Aristotle. He's like, all right, if you want to play these games, we'll do it. But what? He wants to give you what? He wants to give you the what? He wants to give you the intellectual what? Weaponry, so to speak, to engage those kind of folks, right? Because remember, he was frustrated. Remember, he's in a search for truth. You know, Aristotle, Plato, Socrates are these guys really looking for truth, really wanting to know the truth about things. And it's easy for the skeptics and all these guys to come up and question everything, right? Now, again, is there anything wrong with questioning and thinking through things? No, right? What your book calls moderate or something like that, moderate skepticism, what we would just call, or what I call just critical thinking. It's good to be that, right? But it's kind of silly to be just a radical skeptic. And we're going to see why. Now, we left off with Augustine because we were talking about how he had, well, first, obviously, way before Aristotle had come against that. But we're going to look at some of Augustine's responses to radical skepticism. Now, you can see how we left off with Descartes, right? The whole everything's a dream, like, you know, how can you know if we know anything about reality, blah, blah, all this kind of stuff. Well, Augustine, almost in a way, starts making fun of these guys. Because he says, like, look, you think you know all this, and you can look at all this stuff, it's good on the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy. Those are probably, the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy and the IEP, the Internet Encyclopedia of Philosophy, are really good sources on the internet for any of our stuff. Like, I would recommend you look at those for them to look at those. But anyway, this is in the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy. And Augustine, in a way, like, he's going to intellectually engage some of this stuff, but in a way, he's going to almost make fun of them. Because he's going to say, like, oh, you get to be but then he starts just pounding them intellectually, right? And you're going to see what he starts to use to refute some of the skepticism. So let's go right after radical skepticism before we start talking about what we left off last time about what? We left off with what? How can we know reality? How can we know anything? How do we know that you're not dreaming? How do you know that, you know, we can, you know, our senses, if they fool us all the time, all that kind of stuff, right? Like, how can we answer any of that kind of stuff? But first, let's go after this radical skepticism, as if that's not radical already. But here, I'm going to pull this little thing over there. How unintimidating would it be if I was like so mad right now? All right, so let's look at this radical, huh?
That would be funny if, like, Kathy Ledbetter or something walked by, just like, what?
Yeah. And so, but so anyway, let's look at this radical skepticism. Again, as if some of the other stuff that Descartes said, what doesn't turn into radical skepticism. So what do you think would probably be one of the statements about radical skepticism? And again, I've actually heard this. I was in a coffee shop one time, a guy said this. I was like, what do you think it might be? What am I drawing over here? Obviously, I'm not an artiste.
Purse.
It's in a purse, man. Even though it looks
Yeah,
exactly like a purse.
Basket.
You know, make it a little dirty or something. It's your little tool bag, right?
Oh, yeah.
All right, what's in this tool bag?
Oh, it's okay.
Let's stop there, Tim.
That's right. What kind of tools?
For intellectual goals.
Right.
Don't worry about that hammer.
Oh.
Your first principles, right? This is your intellectual tool bag, which includes your first principles, right? What's this one? Law of excluded middle, right? Law of non-contradiction, law of identity, right? This is what you're always carrying around, your little thing. Now we're about to see Augustine take these out and not just use them, but start just beating the absolute fool out of skepticism with these right here, right? This is why, remember when I said the first week of class is so important, because we're constantly going to go back to these, right? So the first thing that the radical skeptic would say after they go through all their arguments, after all their silly stuff, whatever, they would say something like, what do you think it's going to boil down to? We can't know any truths about reality, right? Because if your senses are fooling you, if we can't even show that we're not dreaming, if we can't even show that we can't even prove that you're not in the matrix right now, because anything you say, what? could just be in the matrix, right? Anything that you try to prove, an experiment or whatever, is just one of those things within the matrix, right? So what is their statement going to boil down to? The radical skeptic.
We need the one.
Yeah, we need the one. Piper, I am the one. So look, we can't know what.
Everything.
We can't what? I don't even know what this is, by the way. Can't know anything what? We just can't know anything about reality, right? Can't know we can't know the truth about reality. Now what's wrong with that? That's going to be the radical
Well, it
skeptic.
contradicts itself. It's saying like you know something about knowing about reality.
That's right. That's completely self-defeating, is it not? Is that the truth about reality? Because if that's the truth about reality, then now we can know something about reality. However, if that's not the truth about reality, then we can't even know that what you're saying is true. Right? Look, right here, what is that? Law of non-contradiction. See how the radical skeptical position, ultimately speaking, the skeptic's going to say, we just can't know anything about reality. This is what the guy says as he's puffing on his doobie, right? Can't know anything about reality. Well, how do you know that? How do you know that then, right? If we can't know anything about reality, then how can you possibly know the truth about reality that we can't know anything about reality? That's completely self-defeating. So what does that do? Does that mean now we know everything about reality? No. But at least it opens the door, what?
We know something.
Right, it opens the door at the at minimum. That's the symbol for minimum down here at the bottom of the chalkboard. At the bare minimum, it what? Opens the door to what? To truths about reality, right? Now, so the radical skeptic already is falling over the law of non-contradiction. Now, as Augustine's going to say, he's going to say like, all right, look, I can show you all kinds of stuff. Because what if they say, all right, well, the door is open possibly to some truth about reality. And again, you can read all these on the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, SEP, on the internet. So Augustine says, I can show you all kinds of crap we can know. They're like, what? Like what? He says, well, in fact, you can see Augustine argue hundreds of years, centuries before Descartes, a similar type argument that Descartes offers, at least in regard to your own existence. But before he even gets to that, he gets to the law of excluded middle. He says what? Well, I know there's either one universe or what? Or multiple or infinite universes. Why? How is that true no matter what? I know that there's either, law of excluded middle, there's either, because this is a disjunct, right? Remember our disjunctive syllogisms? There's either one universe, what he calls world. He just says, and by world, he just means whatever there is, the heavens and the earth and whatever the universe entails. There's either one of those, there's either one universe, or there's an infinite amount of them, right? Now, could he possibly be wrong?
Yes.
No. Why? That's just a disjunct. There's either one universe or there's an infinite amount of them. Because what's your other option here? What's your other option?
I guess multiple.
Right, we just would fit here, right? Right. Well, yeah, I see what you're saying, Lacey. Yeah, I mean, this entails, for simplicity's sake, this entails two also. 1, 2, or 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, whatever.
Like,
Right? Yeah, I see what you're saying. But that's not like, he's not saying like it's either one or just an infinite amount in that sense. He's saying, look, there's either one or there's two or there's three or there's four, whatever. Right? So can he possibly be wrong in that? No. Then he says what? Just to have a little fun. Either there's one or there's an infinite amount of them. And I can know that I know what? That there's either one or there's an, and I can know that I can know. So he can know an infinite amount of things just based off this one thing right here, right? Now, and then he goes back up to imply that skepticism again, says, all right, so what you're saying is we can't know the truth. You're right, we can't know the truth, which is what? Completely what? Self-defeating, right? Because if you can't know the truth, you can't know it. But then Augustine say, We can't know the truth, the guy or the skeptic says, we can't know the truth. He says, well, do you know that you don't know the truth? And do you know that you know that you don't know the truth? And you know that you know that you know that you don't know the truth? Just on and on, ad in what? Ad infinitum, right? Ad infinitum. So you can know all that, just what? On and on and on and on and on and on and on. So he keeps going with that. Then he just goes through multiple examples using the law of excluded middle, law of non-contradiction, just showing all of these things that the skeptic can't deny, right? Just by using what? What were these? First principles. Just by using first principles of thought, he goes to show that you can know all kinds of stuff, right? All kinds of stuff. Now, does anybody want to say anything on that before we start to go into what we talked about or where we left off last week about reality? Anybody want to say anything before we go into that? Say. Does anybody else say that? I get in trouble for saying that. Say. I thought it was one of those things that everybody says, but not only is it, I guess, just a Southernism, but it's like an older, like, Southernism. Right? Yeah. All right, so I don't want to jump into that. I want to talk about that for a minute. Like, what do you think about Augustine's arguments in regards to radical skepticism? I'm looking at some of this book stuff. What do you think about that? What do you think about it? Do you think you'd be able to use that in regards to anyone, let's say that they come out of their whatever class and they start saying all this kind of stuff? Do you think that you'd be able to use that kind of stuff?
I use my paper.
Yeah, you did in a way, and I even almost copied some of that stuff to put down because I wanted to make sure that you were on the right track in some of these other areas because I felt like you kind of started to go this way. But I mean, you had a really good paper. All right, I need a volunteer. Who wants to volunteer? Volunteer, need a volunteer. All right, Andrew, you're a real man. Come on. Yeah. All right, get this, get that little desk right there and just face me with it right there. Who's in this timeout chair right here? Look at that. I mean, that's really what that is. That looks like a timeout chair. I'm going to say that's a timeout chair. All right, so Andrew, I'm going to be Mr. Skeptic guy, right?
Okay.
And you're going to be, all you have is your little philosophical tool bag of first principles.
Okay.
So what are the first principles?
Law of excluded middle,
Law of
non-contradiction, law of identity.
Right. And so what's the big one? I wish I wouldn't have said the middle one's law of non-contradiction.
Is it, yeah, like law of non-contradiction.
Right. That's the big one, right? Because if anything goes against that, then so much for what? That.
Right.
Right. So I'm going to be skeptic guy, and you're going to be like the intelligent guy.
Okay.
Well, I shouldn't create a false dichotomy because skeptic guy is probably what?
Could be.
And he's probably intelligent too, right? But he just doesn't have the tools, right, that Andrew over here has, right? But Andrew's going to give them to it. Is that right?
Okay.
All right, where are you from, Andrew?
Here, Douglasville.
Are you really? Where'd you go to high school?
Alexander.
Alexander. That has anything to do with what we're talking about now. I just Andrew's just kind of a cool looking guy, man.
There's something wrong with Alexander.
I mean, it's kind of a sissy school, but you know, we'll let that slide. I'm just kidding.
Do you know
Bobby.
Bobby?
I don't know names. I know faces.
You know, Bobby. All right, so
Bobby, yeah.
Lacey, that's a perfect example of a red herring, completely off topic, irrelevant, right? Hey, do you know Bobby? What shirt do you have on?
I think I do know
Oh,
Bobby.
it's uniform. I work at a preschool,
Oh, okay.
so today's our first day, so I have to start wearing this.
Well, that's nice. All right, so let's say that Andrew and I are having our discussion, right? And I'll be the guy, you know, we're sitting around at night or whatever, we're looking at the stars, and I'm the guy that, yeah, I know. I'm wearing a bikini.
Do we have?
Huh?
As if we have a bottle of wine.
Yeah. I'm wearing a bikini. Andrew's got a bottle of wine. No, I'm just kidding. I'm not kidding. No, really, I'm kidding. All right, so let's say we're sitting here and we're staring off into the fire, and it's just one of those like nights we're having these deep thoughts, whatever. And I tell Andrew, I'm like, Andrew, man, like, all right, guys, everybody, let's come on, hang with us. So let's say we've been watching Discovery Channel, right? And Degrassi's been on there talking about all this cosmological, this, that, and the other. And so I'm like, man, Andrew, Andy B, we just can't really know a lot about reality. In fact, everything's changing all the time. What we think we know, we really don't know. And so we just don't, you can't even, it's impossible to know anything about reality, Andrew. We just can't do it. Well, what might you say? We're talking.
So am I just gonna be like, hey, what you said breaks the law of non-contradiction?
That's right. Except, but put that, but
You
put,
don't know anything.
but put
You
it,
know
hang on, but put it in your own words. How would you say that?
everything. Okay, so you're saying that we really can't know anything.
Right, like we can't know anything about reality.
So if we can't know anything, how do you know that? That we don't know anything?
Yeah, that's right. I mean, yeah, that's right. We can't know anything.
Yeah. What do you mean? How is that right?
All right, so what Andrew might want to do there is obviously, because remember, people aren't used to what? They're not used to thinking like this, right? Because you can always just toss out whatever. So what Andrew's probably gonna have to do is point out that what the guy's saying is what?
It's contradicting itself.
It's incoherent. Incoherent, and not in the pejorative sense, but philosophically, that's an incoherent statement, right?
Right.
So when I say that, like, yeah, that's right. Yeah, you can't even know what I'm saying is true. And so what Andrew's gonna have to do is point out what?
So you believe what you said is true, but yet you're saying we can't believe anything's true. You're saying we can't know anything, but you know what you said. But how do you know what you said if you don't know anything? Doesn't make any sense.
Right. So what that guy's going to try to do is make it sound like, yeah, that's exactly right. That's exactly right. But then Andrew, so he's going to have to take the other side of that dilemma and say, but if that's exactly right, then you can't possibly be what?
Right.
Right. That's why when something's self-defeating, you usually have to show it from both angles. What do I mean by that? When I say you have to show it from both angles. Why? I mean, because if something's false, it can be false 1,000 different ways, right? But if it violates the law of non-contradiction, one way, which has one implication, but then it's also going to be false another way that has what? The other implication, right? So if I say there is no truth, or we can't know anything about reality, well, all right, if we can't know anything about reality, then you've made a statement about reality, which means that you can't possibly know that because that would be a statement about reality. However, on the other hand, if that's true, then what? Then it's completely false, right?
And what you're saying is completely false.
Right.
Therefore,
Because, why? Because you now have assumed to know something about reality, right? But that's exactly what you just said can't be known. All right, everybody give Andrew a hand. We'll let him off you did good, Andrew. Do you need to come to the timeout chair here? All right, so what are we talking about right now when we're talking about what all this little stuff, whatever that was, what was all that about? Radical what? Right, I mean, really, I mean, the guy that walked in one day, he says, when I was talking about the coffee shop, he comes in and he says, all I know is that we cannot know. And I was like, I realize you think you said something profound, but you just contradicted yourself, radically contradicted yourself. How? Because that didn't make sense, right? If you know that you cannot know, then you can't know that you cannot know because now you know that you cannot know. But if you know that you cannot know, then you cannot know, right? I did kind of yell at, but it's one of those things. Again, it's like Blaise Pascal said, what? People almost always arrive at their conclusions based on what they like, not necessarily on what's true, right? Now you could make that self-defeating, couldn't you? How? If you said people always arrive, right? We have to be careful with that, right? Oh, by the way, just a sidetrack, Piper, I remember one of the things you said. You said we couldn't prove a negative, a universal negative. But we can, it's easy to do. Now give me one, it's easy. It really is.
I don't know. Give me something.
No, you're the student, I want you to think. In Piper's paper, he said that we can't prove a universal negative.
I didn't say you
Well, that was the implication, that you can't prove what?
can't prove a negative statement.
Right.
You can't.
So the philosophical way to say that's a universal negative, because it just means categorical, right? You can't prove a categorical negative. So the first problem with that is what?
It wasn't necessarily implication with that. It was more in a scientific sense, not a philosophical.
But that's a philosophical statement. It's not a scientific statement.
I meant it more in science.
So okay, so what do you mean in scientific sense?
That just because, what's the statement? It's not evidence of absence, that kind of line of thing.
So do you agree with the statement that absence of evidence is not evidence of absence? Do you agree or disagree?
Yeah.
Do you agree or disagree? Can't say yeah.
I don't agree.
You agree with that statement? All right, so what if I were to say something like, right now there's an invisible man in this room?
It may or may not true. If you can't touch him, you can't feel him, you can't sense him. It is a possibility. It doesn't necessarily mean that it's a thought that needs to go to great lengths to humor, but it doesn't change the fact that that's a possibility.
But I would say that absence of evidence for the guy in the room is what? Evidence of there even being one in the room, right?
That's the thing, is that a claim itself does not prove itself.
The problem with that statement, evidence of absence, or absence of evidence is not evidence of absence, is it's kind of subjective, because at times the absence of any evidence at all really is, it lends itself to evidence of absence. Right. So for instance, if I said there's a man in here and he came in here and he wiped out the entire room, and then I come in here and the room's not wiped out, right? Well, there's no evidence that he's done that. There's an absence of it. So that really is kind of an evidence for what? It not have happened, right? So you kind of have to take that on a as-is basis. You know, you kind of have to evaluate that independently, I'd say. But anyway, that's neither here nor there for right now. Let's get back to epistemology, even though that is epistemology, right? Because we're talking about what is or isn't, what may or may not be. Epistemology stuff, strictly speaking. Where were we? Somebody help me. I've forgotten all that. Where were we at?
Aristotle, dismantling, I guess, radical.
Or Augustine, right? At least some of Augustine's examples, right?
Yeah.
Oh, but a universal negative. Can we prove a universal negative?
Wait, which again, the rationalism and empiricism?
Empiricism, and we're going to get to that. Empiricism is that
Is the senses one, right?
right? All truth is the only way to know anything that's possibly true at all is through your five senses, right?
Which is your perception.
Well, empiricism. It's going to get into that later. You don't have to worry about that for right now. But empiricism, hard empiricism, is just that if you can't taste it, touch it, feel it, what? Smell it,
It's not true.
then right.
So
Rationalism is that you get to truth primarily only really through the mind, because your senses can what?
So now how does that relate to what you were saying about the invisible man? You were saying that it could possibly be true using basically the thoughts of empiricism. You said you couldn't touch it, see it, feel it, whatever. But you were using what? Was it rationalism, I guess, because that's your mind?
No, we were just saying that his point, saying that
No, I got that about the.
if you can't see it, or if there's no reason to think it's there, then why think it's there to begin with, right? So
It's a thought that can be humored, but it doesn't necessarily mean it's one you have to believe.
Well, we may touch on that in a little bit, right? So anyway, let's get back to our skepticism or epistemology in that regard. What is the problem you see? How might you answer, and think about some of your reflection papers, because some of you said this in your reflection papers. How might you answer that we can't know anything about, whether or not we're dreaming, whether or not, our senses deceive us? How might you answer that kind of stuff? Some of you said some stuff in your reflection papers about it. Anyone? Madison, you didn't say anything all day. All day. I don't know. What about anybody else? Look how red her face is now. What? That's terrible? There are people out there right now robbing banks and shooting kids, and that's terrible.
We expect that from those people. We expect better from
I don't expect that from those idiots. That's why I pop them in the face if I saw. Oh, I need to tell you guys a crazy, crazy situation.
Bank robber with a gun and punch him in the face.
Yeah. I don't have time to get into that. I was a house fire in my neighborhood this week, and it was crazy. But I'll have to tell you that after class or something.
Thursday?
Mm-hmm.
That I saw the fire engines coming out when I was.
Well, this is in Carrollton.
Like 2 or 3 that went by.
This is in Carrollton, though.
Thursday night.
This is Thursday or something. Anyway, I'm gonna get lost in that. So you're back to your reflection papers. The person says, how can we look? How do you know you're not dreaming right now? We can't know any of this kind of stuff. You can't know that you're not in the matrix. Your senses can deceive you. What do you say to that? It's stupid in one sense, but in another sense, it's not stupid, right? Stupid in one sense, right? How is it stupid in one sense?
Because would it make a difference in the sense of if you can't do anything about it and it just is your reality, then it's your reality.
I would say it's stupid in the sense of like, why on earth should I not think there's a desk right here? Why should I think that? But it's not stupid in the sense that it's like Descartes is not stupid, right? He's a genius. So it's not stupid in the sense that this is a real philosophical problem, right? So how might we answer this kind of stuff? I don't want to walk around every day thinking, you know what, I really might be in the Matrix. When I was 19, the Matrix came out. Isn't that the name of it? Yeah, the Matrix. When I saw that at the movies. Well, when we walked out of the little theater, I mean, these are the kind of types of people that you have at that time. Remember, at my life, when I was 19, remember at that time in my life, I didn't care anything about, or I thought I didn't care anything about what? Academics and philosophy and all that kind of stuff. But guess what? But guess who was the guy that was bothered when we walked out of the theater after watching The Matrix? Guess who was the one that was seriously bothered, went home thinking about it all night long? Me. No, I was seriously like, man, how do I know that I'm not in the Matrix? I mean, I know that's kind of absurd, but how can I answer this? Like, how can I really be sure that I'm not in something like that? And then so I was just wondering that and thinking about it. And so on the ride home, I asked my friend, I was like, hey man, I was like, isn't that kind of disturbing? Like, and he's like, what do you mean? I was like, the whole premise of that movie, like, think about it. Like, I mean, I know it's probably not real, but right now that could be the case, that what we're experiencing right now is not real. And what do you think he said? He's like, I'm starving. Let's go. He's not worried about it, right?
Like, calm down.
Right. So it wasn't, it was almost indicative or kind of a, one of those foreshadowing moments. If it had been a movie, well, all right, this guy's going to be the one that probably gets interested in philosophy one day, right? Even though at the time, you don't think that you're interested in those types of questions. But if you're thinking that kind of stuff, you probably really are.
So you kind of foreshadowing.
Right, the soundtrack. What some song was playing, Josh, back there? Which one would it be in 1999? That could have been some Audio Slave. That could have been playing. And then it was a foreshadowing moment. So does anybody care? Does anybody really care? How do we know that what you're experiencing right now is real? That your mom really is your mom? That you're really in a philosophy classroom right now? Right, something like that. Like, does anybody really care? Because I cared. If somebody could have told me at 19, I was like, how can we get out of the freaking Matrix? I would have wanted to hear it. Right. Get out of the freaking Matrix.
Is the guy in the Matrix going to see it in the Matrix?
Yeah, remember, that's the whole point, is that he finds out
That he's in the Matrix?
that he's in it.
Well, the premise behind it was that he is part of a hacker group that kind of knows some of it. And so it bugs him what the question is as to exactly what the Matrix is.
Right, so then he gets to the point where he can he can make the choice to either know the truth about reality or not. Right, that's the pill thing. So right now we're at the moment of, right, to know the truth. So right now that's where we are. Like, look, do you want to know like the truth? Which a lot of philosophy professors or psychologists, all that would be like, ha, and then try to roll you over into skepticism over here. And I'm trying to give you the truth. What I think is the truth, and I think there are better arguments that you can know it, that you really can know reality.
Okay.
One is what? One is that you can't even make the claim that you can't know reality. Why? Right, complete contradiction, right? Violates the law of non-contradiction. So what about those other things though? All right, so we've got that. We've got kind of a dagger in the heart of a radical skepticism. But how can we still answer somebody like Descartes knowing that we're not in dreams or we're not in Matrix and all this kind of stuff? First, let's look at this. Let's look at the whole option of your senses. Can your senses deceive you? Right, so we've already talked about that, right? That your senses can deceive you. And so Descartes argues from that what? That you can't trust them, right? What's the problem with that? Remember, when you dip the stick into the water, he's like, look, the stick looks completely bent. Like your senses are deceiving you. It's not really bent, right? What's the problem with this example? Think about this. All right, here's the bombshell that I want you to take with you and always remember this. When your senses deceive you, how do you know that your senses deceive you? When your senses deceived you in the past, how did you know that your senses deceived you? What served as the corrective to your mistake? Your senses did. So if you dip the stick into the water and it looks bent, and then you pull out, so see it's not bent, how do you know it's not bent? What are you relying on? Your senses. So when you see the mirage you're sitting in the car at the red light and way up ahead in the heat of the day, you think a mirage or whatever, some water or whatever the case may be, and then you get closer, what served as the corrective to show you that was a mistake? Your senses. So do you see what Descartes' doing? Descartes has to assume what? At the same time, what? In order to say that you can't trust your senses, what does he have to assume? That you can trust your senses. Why?
Because you wouldn't be able to know that they were tricked if they weren't proper working.
Right. The only way that Descartes' argument can get off the ground is if you can do what? If you can do what? The only way his argument can get off the ground is for him to assume what? Why? Because you would never know that your quote-unquote senses had deceived you unless what? Your senses what? Also had shown you that you were tricked for the moment. So in order for his argument to even get off the ground, he has to assume that you can trust your senses. But what's the problem with that? You can't argue, your argument can't be that you can't trust your senses while having to assume that what? You can trust your senses. At best, that's a violation of the law, the principle of consistency. Why? Principle of consistency. Why? Because he's being radically inconsistent, right? the principle of consistency is being violated, right? You can't assume at the same time that, oh, well, your senses can deceive you. How do you know that? Well, because my senses have shown me that I was deceived. That's radically inconsistent. So that's, at best, it violates this. At worst, it violates what? The law of non-contradiction, which is an argument that could be said or not said at this point. But at worst, it violates the law of non-contradiction. At best, he's completely, radically what? Inconsistent, right? Because it's your senses that served as the corrective to your senses, which really means what? Right. You have to believe that you can trust your senses if you think your senses are deceiving you, because you wouldn't have known any other way that your senses were deceiving you. Does that make sense? Now, how about this? This is one of the funny ways, well, I think it's funny. You're probably like, I don't care. But when I would talk to people like in a coffee shop or whatever, and they're trying to argue that they can't know anything about external reality, you can ask them just one question, aside from just showing them that that's completely self-defeating. What can you ask them? Who are you talking to? If you don't know that you're dreaming right now, then who are you talking to? Why?
Because how do they know you're real?
Right. They have to assume what? They have to assume that they're talking to somebody that's what? That's actually there, right? For instance, one of them, the guy was saying all this, and I was just like, I'm not even here right now. What do you mean? I'm just some guy in your dream. But you see the problem? If for your argument to work, if you have to assume that there's somebody sitting there that you're talking to that's real, that's in reality, then you can't also sit here and argue that you can't what? Know anything about reality. Because you're having to assume that you know right now that you're talking to some real dude. Otherwise, I could just say, hey, wake, you're talking in your sleep. Wake up, man, you're talking in your sleep. There's nobody here that you're talking to, right? Now, again, the dream argument. How do you know you're dreaming right now? How do you know you're not dreaming right now? Because you've been fooled in the past, right? You've thought that you were dreaming, blah, 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 or you thought it was real, and then you woke up and you were dreaming. How do you know you're not dreaming right now? Does anybody see a parallel? What's the parallel there? How do you know that you were fooled in your dream in the past? Because you can do what? In order for me to try to argue that, hey, have you ever been tricked by your dreams in the past and you thought, that it was real? What do I have to assume? What does that argument assume? Well, think about what we were talking earlier about your senses. Think about what we were saying earlier about your senses. If I have to say to you, hey man, your dreams have tricked you in the past. You've been deceived by your dreams before, right? What do I have to assume as I'm arguing that? That you knew what dreaming, that you can distinguish what? Between dreaming and non-dreaming, between reality and dreaming. Problem there? I can't argue that you can't know that you're dreaming or not dreaming when my very example banks on you what? Knowing what? When you were and weren't dreaming. See how that violates again, at best, the principle of consistency, at worst, what? Possibly what? The law of non-contradiction. I can't try to appeal to you. I can't try to say that, hey, you can't know when you're sleeping and awake in the past. Well, how do you know they've been fooled by in the past other than what? Knowing the difference between the two. Now, does that mean sometimes it's not hard? No, it's not what it means. It just means that obviously you can know the difference between the two. Otherwise, you can't argue. You can't make the argument, right? Does that make sense? Is everybody following me? You can't make the argument. Now, let's say that they're not savvy to all of that and they just default back to, well, look, man, I'm just trying to say this. You can't know anything about reality for sure. What's wrong with that? Right. Do you know that for sure about reality? Right. You can't make if you say that we can't know anything about reality for sure, that's a self-defeating statement because because you've just made a statement about reality, a sure statement about reality that we can't know anything about it for sure. Right? But if you know that, then now you know a truth about reality. Does that make sense? So what am I doing? Am I arguing for reality right now? In a way, yes, but in a way, no. How?
Just disproving what definitely isn't true.
That's exactly right. I'm taking reality as a what? As a given, right? Wow. Why am I taking reality as a given? I'm starting, remember, like the classical philosophers, classical realists start with metaphysics. What is metaphysics? Ontology? What is real? If you start with epistemology, what did we say last week's going to happen? I argue is going to happen. It's going to go off the rails. Why? Because you can never get out of here. You can never get out of here, right? Unless you start here. Now, is that cheating if I start here? Is it cheating if I start with reality? Why? Why is it not cheating?
Yeah.
What's your premise for knowing reality? Well, this. So if this is my starting point, you've got to give me an argument to show me that this premise is false. So all I have to do is what? Do I have to prove reality? No. All I have to do what? Is to show that your argument doesn't work. So if I can show that your argument doesn't work, at best, if I can show that it's even self-defeating, then what am I justified in doing? Just still not right. Why? Because this is just the strongest premise that we have. And remember, any argument that you make, you're going to assume what? That you have some kind of knowledge about what? Reality. If I can show, if you're going to try to argue against me and say that we can't know reality, I'm just going to point out that any argument that you make is going to have to assume the very thing that you say can't be known. One, you're going to have to assume that I'm sitting here, which is reality, right? Because if you convince me, what have you convinced into your argument if there's no reality? Who'd you just convince into your argument? A non-real thing? Something that wasn't in reality, right? You're going to have to assume that you know reality anytime you open your mouth about not knowing anything about reality. So if I can show that your arguments don't work, then I'm justified in saying that I can know about what? Reality. Now, are we trying to say that we know everything about reality? Because that's what we'll say. Oh, so you think you got it all figured out. You think you know everything about reality. Is that what we're saying?
No, you're trying to say you know something about it.
We're saying that you can know something.
Right, that you can know something, right? That's a much more modest claim. We're just saying, look, every argument you try to make defeats itself. That doesn't mean that I'm trying to say that we can know everything there is to know. But we can know some things. And then if we know some things, what can we do? What can we do? We can proceed from that, right? All right, if we know some things, then we're justified in what? Proceeding. Trying to find out if we can know some more things, right? Now, this is going to lead us to one of our, here we go right here. All right, show of hands, is science a good thing? Science a good thing, yes? Raise your hand. Science a bad thing? Raise your hand. Down with science. Now, what is the good thing about science? What's the good thing about it?
It can be used to help people like have type 1 diabetes and like 100 years ago would be dead. So
Right, so you can make some progress,
science
right?
rather than medicine. So.
Right, so we can figure out some things about well, not necessarily about the nature of the things around us, but we can figure out what?
How they work.
Right, we can figure out how things work, right? Which helps us to do what? Things like Lacey just said, discover this or that or the other, right? Science, by its very nature, remember when we talked about there's two types of arguments or two types of reasoning? What were they? The main two, deductive and what?
Inductive.
Deductive and inductive, right? Now, what type of conclusions did deductive arguments give? certain conclusions, right? If the premises are true, then what? The conclusion has to be true. If the premises are true, then the conclusion has to be true, right? Whether you like it or not. Now, what kind of conclusions did inductive type reasoning give us? Probable conclusions, right? Some stronger than others, right? Now, what type of reasoning is science?
I would say inductive.
What does it rely on?
Evidence.
Right, hopefully everything relies on that, right? But what kind of reasoning does the scientific method rely on? On inductive, why?
Because sometimes, you know what I mean, study, you know what I mean?
Well, it's observation,
Yeah.
like you're observing,
Like,
right? If this happens, then this will happen again, right? If this happens, then this will happen again. If this happens, then this will happen again. That's inductive reasoning. Now, again, probable conclusions versus what? Certain conclusions. Again, does that mean that there's no good reason to trust inductive reasoning? No. Now, David Hume's going to say that you can't. He's going to say there's what's called the problem of induction, that you can't even reliably have any sort of logical connection between cause and effect relationships. And if we have time, we'll get into that. But for simplicity's sake, I'm going to say that Hume's wrong. If we have time, I'll argue as to why he's wrong. But science relies on inductive reasoning, right? Which is probable conclusions. Now, if science relies on inductive reasoning, he figured out, or has anyone noticed one of the most problematic claims about science in our modern day, in the West anyway? Do you might remember? So if we have hard empiricism, first let's go ahead and show something about this. Hard empiricism is what? If you can't taste it, touch it, feel it, see it, then it can't possibly be true, right? Because that's the only way to know something that's true, right? David Hume says if there's not some sort of, this is what's called Hume's fork, and because I'll put it like this, like a pitchfork. David Hume says this is the way that you have to know something. Either your five senses or what? Some sort of logical truth. Logical, almost like a tautology. Like bachelors are unmarried males. So there's a logical connection between the two concepts, right? What are bachelors? Right, they're just unmarried males. So you see how there's two concepts, that has to be true. If a bachelor is an unmarried male, an unmarried male is a bachelor, that has to be true, right? Or some sort of mathematical truth, right? Right. So he says this is the only way to know, to get to the actual truth of something, if it's 100% logically connected, or it's immediately verifiable by the five senses, something like that. In fact, what's his famous statement? How does he say it? Does anybody want to Google it? Google it. Somebody Google it real quick. Type in Hume's fork. Read it. Quick. First one to do it gets a free 100 on their assignment.
I wish.
I'm just kidding. I'm just trying to get you to hurry up and do it. But if you do it for real, though, if you don't miss any class, like always give somebody I'll substitute some of your grades, one or two of them. But there's only usually like one person that does that.
Hume's fork.
Yeah, Hume's fork.
Says,
You got it? All right, listen, everybody. Listen real close.
is an explanation developed by later philosophers of David Hume addressing 1730s division of relations of ideas from matters of fact and real existence.
All right, so can you see the quote of it? Do you see where the quote of it is?
The matters of fact and real.
His little, usually it separates it out and he'll have it in quotes what his little statement is. What's the relation of ideas? This one, right? Bachelors are unmarried males. 2 + 2 = 4, right? That's a relation of ideas. The other is the what? Matters of fact, or what? Stuff that's just immediately verifiable, right there with your five senses, right? Does anybody see his little quote? It starts like this. It says, let us take any volume before us, something like that. Do you see it?
I have, if we take in our hand.
There we go. All right, everybody listen real quiet. All right, here we go. Read it.
If we take in our hand any volume of divinity or school metaphysics, for instance, let us ask, does it contain any abstract reasoning concerning quantity or number? No. Does it contain any experimental reasoning concerning matter of fact and existence? No. Commit it then to the flames, for it can contain nothing but sophistry and illusion.
All right, did you get that? Does it contain what, Piper? On this side, what is it? Does it contain what?
Does it contain abstract reasoning concerning quantity or number?
Does it constrain abstract reasoning concerning quantity or number? And then what's the other side?
Does it contain any experimental reasoning concerning matter of fact and existence?
Right. No. Then if it can't do this, then what should we do to it? Says Hume. Commit it then to the flames because it can contain nothing but sophistry and illusion. Right? That's hard empiricism. What's the problem with that? What's the problem? Huge problem.
You can't do anything.
What's the problem?
Is that it's essentially saying that you can't trust your senses.
Well, this is his method for determining the truth, right? You want to know the truth? This and this. What's the problem? Hume's criteria does it what?
That's what I said.
We have to throw his entire criteria what? To the flames. Why? Is it this?
Nope.
It's not that. Can you verify Hume's criteria by your five senses? Nope.
That's what I can't do.
So you have to toss out David Hume's entire project because it don't even work. Self-defeating. Uh-oh. Right? Hard empiricism can't possibly be true because you can't even verify hard empiricism by its own criteria, right? It violates the law of non-contradiction. And it's not logically connected. There's no logical connection there in the sense of abstract reasoning or quantity or number. It's just not there. In fact, if you make it sound like that, it sounds arbitrary, like he just made that principle up, right? Now, here's the surprise of the day. I'm an empiricist. I'm just not a hard empiricist, meaning that I don't think that the only way to get truth is through your five senses or relation of ideas. Why? Well, because that's self-defeating. Now, here's what I was getting to about science. Now, hard empiricism has been blown out of the water for a while because it turned into what's called logical positivism, which was developed in the early mid-1900s. Logical positivism was just this. It was just that. That's all it was. Logical positivism turned into, and in philosophical circles it's dead, but in layman's areas, in almost all rampant on colleges and universities, except possibly in philosophy departments, is this belief here. This turned into this, which is just the same thing as that, which turned into this. And this is our last part of epistemology. What does that say? Can you even read it?
Scientism.
Scientism, which was just, used to be called this, which used to be called this. So what's the problem? Well, Scientology is hilariously goofy. All right, so what's the problem here? What do you think scientism claims?
That's not science, it's not good enough.
That science what?
It's the
That's the
only-
answer to everything.
That tells you what is and isn't what? Tells you what is and isn't true. You want to get to the truth, you gotta use science.
I've had a few professors like that.
BS.
Which
Complete.
are awesome.
It's just straight up philosophically what? Bankrupt. I had a guy tell me one time, he said, what? We were talking about philosophy stuff. The only way to know anything is true is with science. So how do you know that? How do you know that? How do you know that?
Just to figure it out in the lab.
That's not a scientific truth, is it? That's a philosophical assumption, right? Right, so hope I can remember all five of these, probably won't.
Don't fail it.
But for science to get off the ground, assume what?
Oh, is this scientific?
No, this is what scientism fails at. If you're going to say that scientism, remember, we're not arguing science. Science, good. Scientism, bad, right? Just so there's no fooling you, right? Science, good. Scientism, bad. Science first has to assume what? Science cannot prove what? The laws of logic, why? The first principles, why? Has to assume them, right? Has to assume them to get off the ground. So right off the bat, first principles. Science can't prove the first principles because it has to assume the first principles for science to even work, right? So when I say that science is what tells you the truth, what am I using right there? The law of non-contradiction, the law of excluded middle, the law of identity, right? I'm using every one of the first principles just in that statement. So science can't prove those, has to assume them to even work, right? Science can't prove what? What else can it not prove? This is really bad. Why can't science prove mathematics?
That's assuming.
Because it uses them, right? It already assumes them.
It's the basis for something.
What? Can't you? Right. It's just mathematical truths are assumed by science, right? It can't prove them because it uses them.
Because 2 + 2 has to.
Right. Now what's another? Science can't prove ethical truths. Why? I wouldn't say they're decided by us, but we'll get into that when we talk about ethics. Go ahead.
This is kind of interesting, but I did a paper in an English class. It was like, what is the psychology of men who write? And like, biologically, and like in the animal kingdom, it's extremely common.
Right, yeah.
Most of us would argue that.
Forced copulation.
Yes, like half of all orangutan conceptions are because of the hard science, but ethically, if you look at it, we're like, no, you know.
You can't do that. Well, science doesn't say you can or can't. Science just tells you what
science
is.
is
It just says what is. It doesn't tell you the way things what. Here's the key word. Science gives you this, but it doesn't give you this. It gives you what is, but it can't give you what ought to be, right? In some sort of moral sense. Can't prove this. Why? It can't tell you aesthetic truths. What do I mean by aesthetic truths? Like what is or isn't beautiful, right? It can tell you why we think certain things are, right? Or it can point out what things we might think are. Oh, well, this particular face is these proportions and all that. But that doesn't tell you that that's beautiful. It just tells you the ramifications or the specifics as to what we usually think is beautiful, right?
Yeah, they can vary wild. So,
What's that?
I said they can vary.
Well, yeah, they can, but let's say that they all happen to be the same. Let's say they did happen to just all be the same. Well, it could just show you the geometry or the proportions behind what? Those things. Or, for instance, a sunset. Like it can tell you what its composition is, you know, why it looks the way it is, but it can't say whether it is beautiful or not beautiful, right? That goes into some sort of subjective aesthetic truth claim, right? And then lastly, science can't what? This is the funniest one. Science can't prove what? Science. Why? Just has to assume it to get off the bat. Let's go ahead and add another one. Science can't prove that reality is knowable. Why?
Because that's your first assumption, that reality.
It's an external reality to work with.
Well, that's most arguments, but that's an implied assumption.
Right, but it can't prove that, can it? Now, philosophy can say reality is knowable, but I can also turn around and say, but I'm not going to say that I know that just from science. I know that from what?
From your first.
From philosophical principles, right?
Your philosophical first.
Right, my philosophical man bag.
And
Satchel.
So I'm gonna have to use that. Yeah, my satchel. Did you know that purse used to be a man thing? So I'm gonna have to know this with philosophical principles, right? Does that make sense? All right, so unless we have anything else in regards to epistemology, make sure you don't miss the next few weeks, because this is when we're going to start our whole does God exist stuff, which is usually the most fun and sometimes the most heated aspect of the course. We're going to talk about, first we're going to talk about, before we talk about does God exist, before we talk about does God exist, we're going to talk about is there even, like, is the question important? Like, why is it even worth talking about that question, right? And then after we talk, depending on how we decide that, why the question's even valuable, why should we even talk about whether or not God exists? Then we're going to talk about arguments for God's existence, and we're going to talk about arguments against God's existence. And then probably after we talk through that stuff will be when it'll probably be time for your first presentations and arguments, which means that you can make your presentation or argument over anything that we've talked about up until that point, right? So you can argue for God's existence, or you can argue for God's non-existence, or you can argue something about reality or whatever you want to do. But make sure you don't miss any of those, because I think it's good stuff, right? I think so. Yeah, thank you. Go ahead and read your book. Read your whole book. In your book, there's going to be a section over God arguments, like that he offers for God's existence. Unfortunately, again, like I said, this book is just really odd, because this guy, Stephen Hales, graduated from Brown University, an Ivy League school. But it honestly just makes me wonder if he's not just read any of the literature in some of these topics, because these arguments that he offers up for and against God's existence are just atrocious. And so I'm going to have to supplement this heavily in class with, one, stronger arguments for God's existence than he gives, and then stronger arguments for atheism than he gives, because these are just so bad. Really, honestly, just bad. Stuff that we, in my undergrad, we would have laughed about. So it's in here in your contents. It'll just say something like God's existence.
Okay.
Yeah, it just says, I'll actually tell you, it says God. So read all the way down to where it starts. It says, page 63 to why there is no God. Don't read the why there is no God part. So in fact, you can probably divide that up over 2 times, since it'll be a while. We'll go through the God arguments for probably 2 weeks. And then we'll probably go through the why there is no God arguments for probably 2 weeks, if we can stretch it that long. Who's excited about that part? Which topic were you most looking forward to when we did this class? Ethics, or reality stuff, metaphysics, or the God stuff? All right.
I'm really interested in ethics too, because
Yeah, that's probably my next most fun section is talking about ethical stuff.
got a lot of different ideas.
Well, everybody ethics is important to everybody, right?
Yeah.
It has to be. And we'll talk about some of that, why it's fun, just because, all right, for instance, right now, as you leave, think about this. Think about the statement that, hey man, like, who thinks it's wrong to legislate morality? Like, man, you can't legislate morality. That's not for you to do. That's not for us to do.
I don't think it's wrong.
Well, it's impossible. You have to legislate morality. That's all you legislate. That's all you legislate.
That's what you think is
Right.
right.
Don't go 55 miles an hour. Why?
Because you'll-
It must be wrong to drive like a nutcase on the road. Don't steal, don't rob, don't murder people. That's all you legislate is moral positions. Peace out. Bye. I enjoyed it.